The SG-8P Punisher Plasma is the most unique weapon in the Helldivers 2 cutting-edge warbond. Located on page 2, this thing will cost at least 120 medals, in addition to the either $10 or 1,000 super credits that are needed just to unlock the warbond itself. But after doing all that, is this gun even worth it? And how can you actually get the most out of this bad boy? Dr. Pooplove here, and let's talk about it. Now, one thing I'm going to be doing a lot of in this video is I will be comparing this gun to the PLAS-1 Scorcher, because despite being in the Punisher shotgun family, this gun is more like if the grenade launcher and the Scorcher had a baby. I'm sorry, OG Punisher, but you are not the father. Now, the main thing here that ties the Plasma Punisher more to the Scorcher is this weapon trait of explosive, which is not to be confused with the explosive category of guns, by the way. The comments on my last video on the jar made it clear explosive doesn't always mean explosive, unless of course you mean explosive. Now, this kind of explosive means there will be splash damage from this gun, which will require some caution, which we will get into. And the reason why that this is also more comparable to a grenade launcher than a shotgun is that emitted from this gun are these explosive projectiles, which are launched in an arc pattern rather than some straight shooting. And this is also why the first person perspective will basically be useless, as looking from this angle will constantly obstruct your own view. As you can probably see, there's little here that really seems to suggest that this is a shotgun, but I won't question General Brash's arsenal for fear of getting sent to the re-education camps. Now, the damage on this is 100, but like the Scorcher, this is a bit misleading, as maybe the initial shot is 100, but this doesn't seem to count the explosion that also occurs upon impact. In fact, this gun feels like it dishes out quite a bit more than 100. This gun also has a clip capacity of 8 with 12 mags each. That's right, I said what I said. Okay, I'm sorry, I take it all back. Now, the recoil is pretty high on this thing, but given the lower fire rate, it's not gonna actually be that bad. But how does this gun fare out on the battlefield? Well, it's pretty damn good. Versus the bots, this has some of the same benefits that the Scorcher has. You can do things like fire directly at a walker instead of running around behind it and still take it out. Versus the shielded enemies, you can also bypass the shield and dish out damage. And just like the Scorcher, which can damage these tanks from the top, so too can you do this with the Plasma Punisher. Although I will say it seems like you have to try to make sure your shots are getting a little bit below the turret, because some of the shots I was making just seemed to bounce off with no damage if I angled it too high. You can also use this gun just like the Scorcher to creep around and get some chip damage at the weak spots, like on these big bad tanks if you can manage to get close enough. In addition though, there is quite a bit more splash damage here than the Scorcher, so you can use this to take out multiple enemies at once. And the enemies do seem to get staggered a bit when taking that damage, so you can fend them off a little bit longer by using this. Now, versus the Hulks, it's still not very effective. I did try to test this out quite a bit to see if I could arc the weapon such that I could end up hitting their weak spot from behind, but it really wasn't working too well. Perhaps there is a special angle, like I was trying to hit his armpit to see if maybe that would have an effect, or maybe trying to hit walls that are close by and have it bounce off and hit them, but I just wouldn't really expect a lot of consistency here unless someone out there knows of a perfect angle to go for. In general, and potentially a downside, is that versus the bots, you will have to play a little bit closer range with this because it doesn't really fire at that long of distances, so keep that in mind, as typically you are better off dealing with them at range. And it's why it's hard to call this one better than the Scorcher when facing this particular faction. Now, versus the bugs, I'm actually pretty pleasantly surprised at this. Because of the added splash damage, this thing is pretty good at clearing out the smaller guys, but it's also going to damage the bigger guys pretty well too. Bile spewers are taken out quickly due to the explosive damage, and I will say that this is actually pretty good versus the Charger. You can even damage them from head on by shooting the ground below them and letting the explosions give them the old reach around. In general, because of the explosive damage and requiring a little bit less aim, this is a good option for taking them out. Now, versus versus the Bile Titan, you can use this to take the sacs out, but considering you have to arc your shots, you will mostly just end up missing, and you'd have to get pretty close for it to work. A couple other bug related things are this is actually really good against the eggs due to the splash damage, but no, you still can't use this to plug the bug holes. Even though it does feel like a grenade launcher at times, it won't perform that function. Now, the biggest downside versus the bugs is just like the Scorcher in that the explosive damage can also get you. You can kill yourself if the explosion happens to be too close to you, and especially hunters can catch you by surprise and make you end up shooting yourself. The personal shield here can be good for absorbing that hit, but I will say that perhaps due to the slower fire rate, I ended up blowing myself up much less than I would with this Scorcher. So while it still is a risk, I do think it's a bit of a more viable option versus the bugs. Now, before I get to more downsides, I do have some pro tips. Because of the arc on this thing, you can use that to your advantage. You can arc over cover to hit the enemies without exposing yourself, and you can also use height to your advantage to damage enemies from above, also without exposing yourself too much. Also, not something that I have found great use for yet, but you can shoot this thing straight up in the air and rain down some hell from above. It will get a little bit of distance and it'll be at a delay, but maybe there's some good uses for this, so do with that what you will. In general though, this gun is going to be most effective against targets that are grouped up because the splash damage is good and better than the Scorcher. Now, of course, there are some other downsides that I want to talk about, like aiming the arc can be challenging to get used to and can be challenging to get on target, and you can end up whiffing quite a bit. And sometimes these bullets do feel like a waste on single enemies at times. Although unlike the Scorcher, I feel like I don't run out of bullets as easily. The fire rate can also feel sluggish too, which can make it harder to clear the field as you may get overwhelmed before you can get that next bullet in. Also, unlike the Scorcher, which can be very effective at long range, you do need to be pretty close range with this gun, as your bullets don't launch too far, and that of course increases the risk of blowing yourself up. All in all though, I think this is a pretty solid pick, and a good choice versus either the bugs or the bots. But what tips do you have for the Plasma Punisher? And thank you to my YouTube members for joining the Bowel Movement. But otherwise, so long, Pooper Troopers.